For decades, the name USS Wahoo remained suspended between glory and tragedy, wrapped in a silence as dense as the waters that hid it for more than 60 years. The story of this submarine does not begin with its disappearance, but with the reckless spirit that turned it into a legend before it was lost forever. Understanding its fate requires going back to a time when the war in the Pacific was an uncertain and deadly chessboard, a stage where only boldness and determination made the difference between the hunters and the hunted. On board the Wahoo, the atmosphere changed radically when Dudley "Mush" Morton took command. He did not see the submarine as a defensive tool or as a weapon for cautious attacks. He saw it as a machine whose purpose was to strike relentlessly, even in scenarios where any other commander would have backed down. The crew knew it, felt it in the drills, in the direct orders, in the long nights where the silence of the sea announced that the hunt was about to begin. Morton was more than a competent officer. He was a naval predator, one who understood that in modern warfare, surprise was worth more than any armor, and that aggressiveness was, in many cases, the only way to survive. Each patrol transformed the Wahoo into something different. The first represented learning, the second, adaptation, and the third, the consolidation of a style no one had seen before. Morton turned the submarine into a floating legend, a ghost that appeared on Japanese shipping routes, attacked with surgical precision, and vanished before the escorts could react. His crew, far from fearing their commander, admired him deeply, because they understood that his audacity was not whim. It was conviction. Morton had seen the passivity of the first submarine operations and was determined to change it, even if that meant pushing his crew to the limits of what was bearable. The numbers were quick to prove it. Tons and tons of Japanese ships were sinking in a matter of minutes, many destroyed by combined attacks that defied traditional doctrines. While other crews waited for hours in silence to launch a single torpedo, Morton carried out multiple attacks, risky maneuvers, and night pursuits that seemed impossible for a submarine of its size. It was then that the nickname that would define the Wahoo forever emerged: the one-boat wolfpack. It didn't need support, it didn't need escorts, it didn't need to be part of a larger force. With Morton in command, the Wahoo was its own squadron. But the peak of that audacity also coincided with the shadow of an inevitable fate. Both Morton and his crew knew that aggressiveness had a price. After each successful attack came a moment of silence, a moment when the men looked at each other with the certainty that someday an enemy torpedo, a bomb from the sky, or a mechanical failure could turn them into yet another statistic in naval reports. The threat did not diminish the spirit of the Wahoo. On the contrary, it seemed to feed it. Each patrol was bolder than the last, and each decision by Morton was a reminder that war was a stage where only those who did not hesitate survived. By the 7th patrol, the atmosphere in the submarine was very different. Although they maintained the indomitable spirit that had characterized them, there was a silent tension, a sense that they were crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The choice of the Mark 18 electric torpedoes represented that cautious hope of improving their effectiveness. The memory of defective torpedoes that failed at critical moments still haunted them. The crew meticulously inspected every compartment, every battery, every pressure panel. They knew this patrol would take them to one of the most dangerous places in the theater of operations, the entrance to the Sea of Japan. It was an invisible frontier that separated audacity from recklessness. Navigating the straits between Hokkaido and Sakhalin Island was almost suicidal. Shallow waters, constant air surveillance, and Japanese escorts patrolling with the conviction that any intruder had to be destroyed without mercy. No submarine could cross that area without exposing itself to extreme risk, but Morton saw that strait as a strategic doorway. If he could penetrate it and sow chaos inside the Sea of Japan, the impact would be devastating for the Japanese war effort. That promise of strategic advantage was enough for Morton, and his crew, though aware of the danger, trusted him enough to follow without hesitation. Throughout that final patrol, the Wahoo left a trail of destruction that would later be confirmed by Japanese sources. Transport ships, cargo vessels, even escort ships. All were surprised by the surgical ferocity of the American submarine. In Japanese records, the name Wahoo began to appear with growing concern, as if it were a shadow impossible to disperse. However, with every successful torpedo, with every accurate shot, the risk increased. The pressure in the compartments, the condition of the batteries, the accumulated fatigue, everything began to weigh on the metal structure of the submarine and on the hearts of the men. The last signal from the Wahoo, that brief and routine message announcing that it had crossed the strait without incident, turned out to be the ship's last breath. After that message, silence spread, deep and absolute. Days went by, and there were no new reports. Neither Allies nor reconnaissance aircraft could locate any traces. For the first time since Morton took command, the Wahoo did not return to port, did not send signals, did not surface under the moon to recharge its batteries. It simply disappeared. Meanwhile, in Japan, the records told another story. On October 11, 1943, a Japanese anti-submarine aircraft detected a shadow on the surface of the strait. It approached, dropped bombs, and saw a violent explosion near the conning tower. From that moment on, escort ships joined the attack, dropping depth charges for hours. That lethal combination of sky and sea was recorded as a confirmed sinking. But for the United States, that information would not arrive until decades later. The only certain thing at that moment was the absence of a submarine that had escaped everything. When silence turned into certainty, the blow was devastating. It was not only a submarine that had been lost, a symbol had been lost, and the families, condemned to receive vague telegrams, were trapped between sorrow and uncertainty, wondering what the last moments of the men they loved had been like. Decades later, when the Cold War complicated any attempt to explore disputed waters, it seemed almost impossible to locate the remains of the Wahoo. However, the determination of relatives, historians, and former sailors kept the search alive. It was not just about finding a shipwreck, but about closing a chapter of history that had remained open for far too long. The search for the Wahoo became an international mission, an effort that transcended flags and old rivalries. The United States contributed its archives, Japan, its military records, Russia, its access to the waters of the strait. What had once been a battlefield was now becoming a space for technical and human cooperation, and after years of work, the metallic echoes of the sonar finally revealed an unmistakable shape lying on the seabed. The image of the ROV descending through the water column, gradually revealing the figure of the submarine, remains one of the most moving moments in modern naval archaeology. There it was, whole, silent, motionless. The conning tower showed exactly the damage described in the Japanese reports. And in that instant, after more than 6 decades, the story took solid form. From the moment the ROV illuminated the hull of the Wahoo, a second story began. That of the profound meaning of that discovery. It was not simply the discovery of a lost wreck, but the material confirmation of something that for decades had existed only in incomplete documents, scattered rumors, and the oral memory of those who had served alongside Morton, or had trained with members of the crew. Seeing the submarine resting on the seabed, preserved in solemn silence, produced an immediate emotional impact on everyone involved. It was not a metal structure. It was a burial mound, a collective tomb, and a frozen fragment of the past. The researchers who took part in the mission described in detail the impression that comes from observing a submarine lost in combat. There is no noise, no movement, no human trace. The hull, though corroded by time, still retains the lines that made it lethal, and the conning tower, deformed by the explosion that doomed it, still seems charged with history, as if it held unsaid words, orders given in a firm voice, the alarms that sounded in its last seconds. Time did not destroy the essence of the Wahoo. it only covered it in silence. And that silence became the central point of the subsequent reflection. In it converged all the questions that had haunted the families for decades. What was the impact like? Did they die instantly? Did they have time to react? Did they know that this patrol would be the last? While many of these questions could not be answered with absolute precision, the physical evidence of the hull provided new elements. The visible fracture in the tower suggested an instant explosion, probably so devastating that the submarine had no room to maneuver. The later depth charges would have ensured its total destruction, sealing its fate in a matter of minutes. With that information, naval historians began to reconstruct, with greater accuracy, the last moments of the ship. The La Perouse Strait, a setting full of tension, became a deadly corridor where the combination of topography, surveillance, and enemy weaponry formed an almost perfect trap. The Wahoo, even with Morton's skill, was immensely exposed. The decision to sail on the surface, though tactically understandable to gain speed and escape before dawn, turned it into an identifiable silhouette for enemy aircraft. That fraction of opportunity was enough for a single bomb to change history forever. A well-placed bomb on a submarine not only destroys metal, it destroys balance, damages systems, opens leaks that make any survival maneuver impossible. It was a precise, forceful, almost surgical impact. And what followed, the depth charges dropped by the Japanese escorts, was the final thrust that drove the Wahoo into the depths without even allowing it to send a distress signal. The speed of the outcome explains why, from the American point of view, the submarine simply disappeared. There was no time for transmissions, for prolonged evasive maneuvers, or for heroic decisions. It was a sudden, definitive blow. That knowledge brought comfort to some families. Knowing that their loved ones probably did not suffer long minutes of anguish inside a slowly imploding hull was a silent relief. Hard to express, but deeply human. For other families, however, the confirmation of the final fate reopened old wounds. War, in the end, does not distinguish between glory and loss. It only leaves absences that grow deeper with the years. The discovery also rekindled the debate about Morton's tactical aggressiveness. For years, historians discussed whether his almost reckless style contributed excessively to the risk that ultimately destroyed them. But those who studied his career, and particularly the men who served under him, defended a more complete view. Morton was not careless. He was a reflection of his time. He was the necessary response to a scenario where torpedoes failed, where slow decisions could mean death, where American submarine warfare needed leaders who broke molds and understood that, without audacity, the sea was simply a cemetery without strategic results. In fact, if the Wahoo's career showed anything before its end, it was that calculated aggressiveness can change the course of a campaign. Its attacks inside the Sea of Japan sowed fear, uncertainty, and chaos in critical supply routes. In more than one Japanese report, it is mentioned that the Wahoo operated as if it completely ignored the limits of prudence, which, seen from the American side, was an involuntary compliment. That psychological and material impact was so strong that, even after its disappearance, the name Wahoo kept appearing in Japanese reports as if it were a persistent enemy, hard to eliminate, capable of returning at any moment. The discovery of the wreck forever changed the way this story is told. No longer is it about a submarine lost on the margins of the war, but about a ship whose fate can finally be explained with solid evidence. And that new clarity made it possible to organize formal tributes, international ceremonies, and commemorative acts in which the flags of the countries involved, United States, Japan, and Russia, were raised together in memory of the men who never returned. In some ceremonies, relatives of the crew placed sealed letters, written decades later, addressed to fathers, brothers, grandfathers, or uncles who died before they were born. Those letters repeated the same message. Now we know where you are. That simple fact, that physical certainty, became a balm that lightened some of the pain that had been passed down from generation to generation. The historical impact was also immense. The Wahoo ceased to be a myth and became a tangible reference of American submarine valor during the Second World War. Its story began to be explained in greater detail in museums, documentaries, lectures, and military academies. Morton's tactical aggressiveness, previously seen as an anomaly, is now analyzed as a key point in the evolution of submarine warfare in the Pacific. His risks are studied, but so are his decisive achievements, because although its end was tragic, none of its successes are lost in the shadow. Every ship sunk, every successful attack, every daring maneuver contributed directly to weakening the Japanese logistical network, and that contribution, analyzed from a distance, reveals that the Wahoo's sacrifice was not in vain, but an integral part of a larger effort that ultimately tipped the balance of the conflict. The silence of the wreck, the weight of the water above, the absolute stillness in which it rests do not contradict its legacy. They amplify it. The submarine lies as a reminder that naval history is not written solely with victories, but also with losses that demand to be understood and remembered. And within that corroded hull covered in sediment, the memory of 60 men who sailed into the unknown with the conviction that their duty was more important than their fear still beats. Their grave is not marked by stone, but by abyssal pressure. It has no flowers, but luminous creatures that move around it like silent sentinels. It has no epitaphs, but its story continues to resonate in every generation that finds in the Wahoo a symbol of bravery, sacrifice, and unbreakable determination. And as long as the oceans continue to guard secrets, the Wahoo will remain there, intact in essence, guarded by darkness and memory, turned into an eternal witness of a time when young men risked everything for a future they would never see. Its story, now complete, is no longer a burdensome mystery. It is a legacy that illuminates. That discovery, though silent and carried out in one of the most remote corners of the planet, unleashed a wave of deep reflections among historians, veterans, oceanographers, and relatives of the Wahoo's crew. Finding a submarine lost for more than 6 decades is not just a historical fact. It is an emotional bridge that connects the present with an episode frozen in time, guarded by layers of water, darkness, and oblivion. And in the case of the Wahoo, that bridge opened the way to a more intimate understanding of the sacrifice of those men whose story seemed destined to live in uncertainty. Among the experts who analyzed the wreck, a particular concern arose. How had the Wahoo remained so intact in an area so dangerous and so heavily watched? The answer lay in the hidden geography of the strait. La Perouse is a treacherous channel where icy currents descend from the north, collide with warmer flows from the Pacific, and generate whirlpools that constantly reshape the seabed. In some areas, the underwater relief presents abrupt depressions, small hollows where a heavy object can fall and remain sheltered from the main currents. That is exactly what happened to the Wahoo. When the impact sank it did not plunge in free fall toward the open bottom. It fell into a coastal depression, small but deep, which acted as a natural refuge. That vertical sinking, almost elegant in its tragic inevitability, allowed the hull to settle without breaking into multiple fragments, as did happen with other submarines sunk in shallow waters. That is why, when discovered, the Wahoo appeared almost intact, as if the war had ended just a few days earlier, and not more than half a century ago. That exceptional preservation created new scientific opportunities. For experts in naval architecture, it meant having visual access to an American Second World War submarine in a condition very close to its original state. For engineers specialized in torpedoes and explosions, it offered tangible clues about how an aerial impact could instantly compromise the integrity of a vessel designed to withstand extreme pressure. And for forensic anthropologists, it revealed how the remains of a military wreck integrate into the marine ecosystem, without losing their essential characteristics. But beyond its technical value, the wreck became a powerful, almost spiritual symbol. For years, the Wahoo had been remembered for its boldness, its destructive energy, and the intense personality of its commander. However, seeing it there, motionless in the abyssal silence, gave it a completely new dimension, that of sacrifice. The lights of the ROV illuminating the shattered tower evoked images of the submarine's last seconds, and although no one can see the exact moment of the sinking, the physical evidence suggests a quick, brutal, and definitive end. The specialists who took part in the mission recounted the moment when the cameras showed the closed hatches. That detail, so simple yet so revealing, offered a silent story about what the men experienced in their final moments. The hatch had not been opened. There had been no attempt to escape. There had been no desperate struggle to get out. That confirmed what many had hoped, that the aerial impact must have been so severe that there was not even time for the crew to understand what was happening. Death was instantaneous, and that knowledge, though somber, offered a level of peace to those who feared more anguishing scenarios. The discovery of the Wahoo also served as a reminder of the immense risk that this seventh patrol represented. To reach the Sea of Japan, the submarine had to cross a narrow corridor full of threats that could not be avoided with simple maneuvers. Japanese ships patrolled day and night, planes dropped bombs every time they detected a shadow, and the shallow waters made any deep dive to escape prolonged attacks extremely difficult. Morton knew this. His crew knew it too, but they crossed anyway. That decision, which some considered almost reckless, is now viewed from a different perspective. It was a deliberate act of war at a time when victory depended on assuming extreme risks. With the passage of time, the Wahoo began to gain a new position in the American military imagination. It was no longer just the representation of a risky command. It was a symbol of absolute commitment to the mission, a mission that led 60 men to face an area where the probability of survival was almost zero. Morton's story ceased to focus solely on his tactics and began to include his humanity, a commander who knew the danger but believed he had to strike where it would hurt the enemy the most. The search itself became a parallel story of civil courage. The families never gave up hope of finding the submarine, even though for decades they were told it was practically impossible. Geopolitical tensions, the inaccessibility of the area, and the lack of adequate technology made it seem that Wahoo's tomb was destined to remain hidden forever. But persistence, fueled more by love than by science, ended up being the key that united several nations in accomplishing an act that transcended rivalries. Because the day the Wahoo was located, it was not found by Americans alone. It was found by Japanese, Russians, and Australians working together. That fact alone transformed the narrative. The very strait that had been a zone of death and combat became a space of cooperation between former enemies. And the hull of the Wahoo, which once symbolized destruction for Japan, became a point of union for understanding the shared tragedy of war. The most moving part came later, when images of the wreck were shared with the families. Private gatherings were organized in which descendants of the crew could see the submarine where their grandparents, parents, or uncles had spent their last moments. Some cried. Others smiled shyly, as if seeing the silent hull allowed them to complete an emotional puzzle that had remained unfinished throughout their lives. One family member expressed a phrase that resonated deeply. "I didn't know where his body was, but now I know where his story is." That kind of emotional closure does not appear in history books, but it is as important as any technical or tactical data. Because military history is not made only of victories and defeats, it is made of lives, of young men who left their homes, of mothers who received devastating telegrams, of siblings who grew up without knowing what had really happened. The Wahoo represented a hole in the memory of dozens of families, and finding it meant that void could begin to be filled, even if only a little. The wreck also quickly became part of educational narratives. In naval academies, its story is analyzed as an example of leadership in extreme situations, of calculated boldness, and of the limits of courage in combat. In museums, its story is told alongside maps, photographs, and testimonies from the time, allowing new generations to understand the real cost of conflicts and the emotional complexity behind every military operation. Even the technical divers who studied the area pointed out something that is rarely mentioned. The sea around the Wahoo is strangely calm. Marine life moves gently among the corroded structures, as if somehow recognizing the solemnity of the place. In one particular shot, captured by the ROV, a school of fish passed slowly in front of the destroyed tower, in a movement that seemed almost ceremonial. It was a simple but powerful image, reminding us that life goes on even around death, that the ocean turns the tragic into part of its eternal cycle. And so, the story of the Wahoo, which for years had been an incomplete mystery, became a complete, deep, emotional, and technically fascinating narrative. It was no longer a shadow lost in the war. It was a tangible symbol of bravery, a reminder of collective sacrifice, and a bridge between past and present. The sea may have hidden it, but it was never able to erase its legacy. Now, thanks to decades of effort, that legacy belongs not only to military history, but to shared human memory. As the years after the discovery went by, the story of the Wahoo began to take on a new dimension. It stopped being only a war chapter and became a reminder of the fragility of human life in times of war and of the profound meaning of recovering lost memory. The wreck, still intact in its silence, began to be studied not only by soldiers and historians, but also by philosophers, psychologists, and specialists in collective memory, who saw in it a perfect example of how time turns tragedy into legacy. One of the most analyzed aspects was the emotional bond between the crew and their commander. Morton was a leader who inspired fierce loyalty, not because he was harsh or inflexible, but because he embodied the courage his men wanted to have. The accounts of those who had served with him before the Wahoo are revealing. They spoke of a man who made quick decisions, who did not hesitate under pressure, and who understood better than anyone the kind of war they were fighting. For many, he was almost a tragic hero, someone who knew his aggressiveness could cost him his life, but also understood that passivity could cost the course of the war. That duality between courage and sacrifice is what made the Wahoo so emblematic. It was not simply a submarine that disappeared. It was the reflection of the American spirit at a critical moment in the conflict. And when the wreck was found, that spirit seemed to resurface from the bottom of the sea, intact in its essence, as if time had been unable to erode what it represented. The meticulous study of the hull revealed other details that enriched the Wahoo's narrative. For example, the impact marks around the tower showed that, after the initial bomb, the submarine had been struck by explosions that likely finished destabilizing it. Those metallic scars, engraved on the body of the ship like permanent wounds, proved that the crew had been in an impossible situation, with no room to maneuver or options to fight back. It was the raw reality of submarine warfare. A single moment could change everything. But there were also details that spoke of everyday life on board. The ROV captured images of a rusty tool near the bow, probably left there by a sailor during the days before the attack. Remains of cables were seen aligned with almost intact precision, perhaps kept that way until the very last moment. They even identified patches of paint still visible beneath the layers of sediment, reminding us that the Wahoo had not always been a dark wreck, but a vibrant machine filled with young men who lived, ate, laughed, and shared dreams inside a metal space pressed by war. That contrast, the life and death, the vibrant past under the eternal stillness, became one of the central themes in the cultural analysis of the submarine. University professors began including the Wahoo case in courses on historical memory, showing how a lost ship can become a dialogue between generations. Students, many born decades after the conflict, observed images of the wreck with a mix of fascination and sadness, understanding that history is not just a timeline. It is an ocean of lives, decisions and sacrifices that still resonate. In a lecture given in the United States shortly after the discovery, a naval historian explained that every military wreck found is like opening a book buried under tons of water, a book that was never destroyed, only hidden. And in the case of the Wahoo, that book contained pages that spoke of extreme bravery, risky decisions, moments of triumph, and an end that, although tragic, was consistent with the life the submarine had led from the first day. The discovery also renewed interest in studying other lost submarines. Researchers began asking how many stories like this still lie hidden beneath the oceans, waiting to be found. For search teams, the Wahoo case became a model of international cooperation, demonstrating that no country alone can solve the mysteries of the sea, but that together they can unearth truths that benefit all of humanity. Formal recognition from the United States Navy was not long in coming. Tributes were organized, official publications produced, and monuments dedicated to fallen submariners were restored. In public ceremonies, veterans and descendants shared memories, some with tears, others with smiles, all with the same feeling: gratitude. Gratitude for having found an answer. Gratitude because the story had finally come full circle. Many family members said that, for decades, the absence of a place to honor their loved ones had been an open wound. Symbolic graves did not offer the same comfort as knowing exactly where the story ended. It was not necessary to recover the bodies. The location of the submarine was enough. The steel tomb, protected by the ocean, became a sacred place, even if inaccessible. Japan also had emotional reactions. Stories published in local media recounted how some Japanese researchers felt deeply moved upon seeing the wreck. For them, the Wahoo was no longer a symbol of enemy destruction, but a reminder of painful times shared by both countries. Respect for the fallen, friends and foes alike, is a fundamental part of Japanese culture, and that view was reflected in reports that described the discovery as a moment of historic reconciliation. The repercussions in Russia were also notable. Russian cooperation in the search for the Wahoo paved the way for more joint investigations of Second World War wrecks in the waters of the North Pacific. Russia, with technical access to restricted areas and a strong oceanographic tradition, became an unexpected ally in preserving American memory. That collaboration helped ease tensions and opened paths for scientific dialogue in complex years. But none of this would have been possible without the tireless spirit of the relatives who founded the Wahoo Project Group, who for years wrote letters, made phone calls, met with officials and organized campaigns to keep the search alive. Their dedication became a flame that never went out, fueled by the conviction that no sacrificed life should be forgotten. That flame illuminated a path that ultimately led to the discovery. Today, the story of the Wahoo is told not as an unfinished tale, but as a complete testament of human courage. Its silent hull in La Perouse is more than a metal remnant. It is a time capsule that preserves the essence of those who crewed it. Every rivet, every rusted valve, every section deformed by the explosion speaks for them. It speaks of their duty. It speaks of their courage. It speaks of their end. And while the ocean continues to guard their rest, the memory of the Wahoo will remain alive in everyone who hears its story, in every researcher who studies its legacy, in every family that finds comfort in knowing that finally their ship was found. It rests at the bottom of the sea, but its story now floats on the surface of human remembrance, firm, indelible, and eternal. The story of the Wahoo began to take a new turn in the collective consciousness when its discovery was no longer just news, but reflection. In conferences, documentaries, and gatherings of historians, a key idea was repeated. Finding a lost submarine is not just a technical act, but a human one. And in the case of the Wahoo, that human act expanded beyond any border, connecting people who never met, but who were united by an invisible bond of memory, respect, and search for truth. As studies on the wreck progressed, there was renewed interest in understanding the daily routine inside the submarine. It was not just about analyzing its structure or the damage from the impact, but about reconstructing life within during those final days. Second World War submarines were claustrophobic environments, scorched by accumulated heat, permeated with the smell of diesel, metal, and exhausted bodies. Men slept in narrow bunks, some even on torpedoes covered with improvised blankets. The passageways were narrow, the noises constant, and each day was divided into rigid shifts where rest was a scarce luxury. In the Wahoo, however, that routine took on another dimension because of Morton's style. The commander demanded excellence, but he also fostered camaraderie. The few direct testimonies from survivors of previous patrols portray a united crew, aware of the risk, but also proud to be part of a submarine whose reputation grew with each successful patrol. That brotherhood, forged under extreme pressure, made the disappearance of the Wahoo weigh even more heavily on the morale of the American submarine force. It was as if the soul of an entire body had been ripped out in one blow. Experts in submarine warfare began to see the Wahoo as an exceptional case. Few submarines achieved so many sinkings in such a short time, and almost none did so with such an aggressively tactical style. The submarine did not just attack, it hunted. Its crew learned to move in absolute silence, to listen to the echo of enemy propellers, to count seconds before impacts, to hold their breath during deep dives so as not to increase the strain in saturated compartments. Each attack was a dangerous symphony, where the smallest mistake could mean instant death. That level of precision explains why Wahoo's final attacks inside the sea of Japan were so impactful. The submarine moved with an efficiency almost impossible for its size and technological limitations. Its electric torpedoes, silent and without a trail of bubbles, confused the enemy escorts who, used to detecting wakes, found themselves facing an invisible foe. Japanese communications of the time reveal a deep sense of frustration at a submarine that seemed to move like a shadow, leaving no tracks, offering no seconds of reaction. However, that same invisibility led to its end. By operating on the surface during its withdrawal, the Wahoo lost its most precious advantage: anonymity. Sailing above the water made it visible from the air, and the sky during the war was a territory where speed and surprise belonged to the planes, not to submarines. That moment of exposure, of absolute vulnerability, marked the beginning of the end. Although the air attack was brief, its precision was deadly. Damage analyses indicate that the bomb struck directly in a critical area of the tower, destroying essential systems in a fraction of a second. The explosion would have shaken the entire hull like an internal thunderclap, bending metal, breaking electrical connections, and leaving the vessel incapable of reacting. What followed, the Japanese depth charges, was a formality, an act that sealed what the bomb had already sentenced. The final sequence of the sinking was quick. The Wahoo began to tilt toward the bow, and with the weight of water entering through open fractures, it descended with no possibility of control. For the men on board, that descent was, in all likelihood, instantaneous. And although the tragedy was devastating, that rapid end spared their last moments from prolonged anguish, a truth that would later bring comfort to families. But the ocean, in its immensity, did what it always does with metal objects that fall into it. It wrapped them, silenced them, and turned them into part of its deep landscape. For decades, the Wahoo stayed there, among shadows and currents, being slowly reclaimed by marine life. The animals that now move around the hull do not distinguish between war and peace. They simply inhabit. That cosmic indifference of the sea turns every wreck into a reminder that time goes on no matter how great our battles may have been. However, when the submarine was found, that stopped time seemed to resume. The story was once again linked to its origin, and that moment was so important that the United States Navy even organized a symbolic ceremony, with veterans of the submarine force attending in representation of the men of the Wahoo. It was a solemn act, silent, yet laden with meaning. Some veterans touched commemorative plaques with tears in their eyes, remembering friends who never came back. Others, already in the final stage of their lives, said they finally felt they could rest, knowing the ship had been found. The discovery did not just solve a mystery, it opened a door to a deep understanding of the human cost of submarine warfare. In the Second World War, more than 50 American submarines disappeared without a trace. Each one of them represented dozens of families who never knew what had happened to their loved ones. The Wahoo case became a hopeful example of how modern technology, combined with human perseverance, can recover lost fragments of the past and restore the dignity of those who died without a grave. After the discovery, there was growing interest in filming documentaries showing the process, not only from a technical point of view, but also an emotional one. Cameras captured researchers discussing old maps, comparing 1943 coordinates with modern satellite data, reviewing Japanese reports written by hand, and studying ocean currents to understand how the submarine's remains might have shifted over time. Nothing was simple. Each clue was a difficult piece in a huge puzzle. Interviews with the experts revealed something even deeper. The search was not only scientific, it was also personal. As they studied Wahoo's movements, the researchers felt they were spiritually accompanying the crew on their final journey. When they finally located the wreck, the emotion on the search vessel was indescribable. Some scientists stood still, in silence, staring at the screens. Others covered their faces. Others clenched their fists as if they were greeting old lost friends. The moment the ROV's camera showed the destroyed tower was interpreted differently by each member of the team. For some, it was a bitter confirmation. For others, it was a necessary closure. For all, it was an honor to have been the first to see the submarine in more than 60 years. Over time, the Wahoo went from being a mysterious case to a symbol of international cooperation. What had once been a scene of death and conflict had become a point of union between former adversaries. And that transformation is perhaps the most powerful element in this whole story. The sea does not distinguish flags, but we can choose to remember with respect, honor, and humanity. Thus, the Wahoo remains in its final rest, protected by the ocean and honored by those who study its legacy. There are no flowers on its grave, but there is light. The light of the cameras that found it. The light of restored knowledge. The light of human memory that refuses to let its story disappear. And as long as there are people willing to tell its story, as long as future generations keep learning from the sacrifice of those 60 men, the Wahoo will never be truly lost. Its hull lies in the darkness, but its legacy shines brightly on the surface. As studies on the Wahoo wreck advanced, researchers began to ask what else the submarine could reveal about submarine warfare in the Pacific. There was particular interest in understanding how internal structures actually behaved after a direct air attack. This was not something that could be recreated accurately in a laboratory. The Wahoo, by contrast, offered physical, evidence unaltered by human intervention, a pure scenario that allowed them to study the real effect of the explosion on a submarine in combat. The ROV's high-definition cameras captured unprecedented images of the collapsed interior. Although the passing decades had caused corrosion, it was still possible to identify compartments. Some valves remained in the same position in which they had been left. The torpedo room showed traces of the mechanisms used to fire the electric projectiles, while in other areas the deformations of the metal told a silent story of the impact that doomed it. The tilt of the hull showed that the submarine had begun to sink by the bow, confirming what previous analyses had suggested. Critical damage had occurred toward the upper part of the ship and had caused an immediate loss of control. One of the most surprising findings was a section of the hull where the instruments remained aligned almost exactly as they would have been on the day of the attack. It was as if time had decided not to continue its destructive work in that particular corner. Naval engineering specialists who studied the images noted that, although corrosion was evident, Wahoo's structural integrity was remarkable. This made it possible to carry out a complete digital reconstruction of the submarine with a level of accuracy never before achieved for a lost vessel of that era. The reconstruction gave way to something more emotional, a three-dimensional visualization of what it would have been like to sail aboard the Wahoo during its patrols. The engineers recreated sounds, vibrations, and movements based on the ship's historical records and mathematical models of submarines of its class. This recreation allowed historians and relatives to experience, even virtually, how the metal vibrated during rapid dives, how the pipes creaked under the pressure of the ocean, how the compartments were lit with red lights during night attacks. In that simulation, there was one particularly impactful moment, when the team reproduced the sequence of the attack at La Pérouse. Although the recreation did not aim to dramatize the event, the combination of technical data and real records made it possible to show the instant when the Japanese bomb detonated near the tower. The blast echoed with chilling fidelity, demonstrating how an external explosion could shake every part of the submarine. That simulation, presented at a naval conference, left the auditorium in silence. Everyone knew they were witnessing a representation, but they also knew it had happened, that real men had been inside that hull when everything went dark. From this recreation, they also began studying the decisions that had led the Wahoo to that fatal strait. Were there alternatives? Could it have taken another route? Strategic analyses concluded that, from the perspective of any submarine commander of the time, Morton had acted logically and consistently with the Wahoo's operational philosophy. He had entered one of the most heavily guarded areas of the Pacific, yes, but also one where the strategic results could be enormous. It was not an impulsive act, it was a calculated act, although filled with risks. Some historians suggested that, if the Wahoo had used traditional torpedoes with bubble wakes instead of the Mark 18 electrics, its position might have been detected earlier during the previous attacks. In other words, the very technology that allowed it to sink several ships without revealing itself also contributed to placing the submarine in an extremely dangerous position, because Morton decided to continue operating with confidence in the silent capabilities of the Mark 18. War is like that. Technological advances that offer immediate advantages can also have unforeseen consequences. When the full results of the wreck analysis were published, they had a deep impact on military academies around the world. Officers in training studied the Wahoo case as an example of leadership under pressure, but also as an illustration of the delicate balance between boldness and survival. In one of the most memorable conferences on the subject, a retired commander stated that the line between courage and sacrifice is not visible during war. It only appears decades later when history has enough data to understand what happened. That sentence was engraved as a summary of the Wahoo's legacy. Meanwhile, families continued to find ways to honor the crew. Some created foundations in the names of their lost relatives. Others donated letters, photographs, and personal documents to naval museums. In those simple objects, handwritten messages, watches that stopped working in 1943, worn uniform insignias, the true heart of the story is hidden. They were not just sailors. They were sons, brothers, husbands, friends. Many were barely between 18 and 25 years old. Men who had only just begun to live when the war called them. With the submarine finally found, the United States Navy decided to officially designate the wreck site as a war grave, protected from commercial exploration or invasive scientific intrusion. The area became an intangible space of memory, one that could only be visited virtually through the images captured by the ROVs. Any attempt to recover objects was prohibited, not because of political restrictions, but out of respect. The Wahoo is not a museum, it is a burial place, and as such, it must remain inviolate. The symbolic meaning of this decision resonated deeply in the field of maritime archaeology. For years, many military wrecks had been explored or even looted, sparking intense ethical debates. The Wahoo case demonstrated the importance of treating these sites with the same respect given to a cemetery on land. It was a clear statement: the memory of the fallen has no expiration date. The Wahoo's legacy also expanded into the field of documentary filmmaking. Several production companies began developing projects based on the submarine story, using the full narrative from its construction to its discovery. Directors and screenwriters saw in this story a perfect structure: a bold hero, a journey full of risks, a tragic disappearance, and a discovery that closed an emotional and human cycle. In one of these documentaries, a historian described the Wahoo as a voice that remained mute for decades, and that now, thanks to technology, has spoken again. That metaphor captured the essence of the discovery. The idea that wrecks are not just inert remains, but motionless storytellers waiting patiently to be heard. And as long as that voice continues to resonate, the Wahoo will remain a beacon in naval history. A reminder that courage can lead to great achievements, but also to great sacrifices. That the men who fight underwater face not only the enemy, but an unforgiving environment that does not tolerate mistakes. That the sea is both tomb and archive, both guardian and witness. Today, the story of the Wahoo continues to grow. Every year, new research, new conferences, new digital reconstructions enrich the narrative. And each new discovery about the submarine reveals something more about its crew, about its commander, about the war, and about the human spirit that persists even in the darkest moments. Thus, the Wahoo remains in the depths, surrounded by the eternal silence of the ocean, but its memory rises powerfully to the surface, becoming part of a story much larger than itself. A story of courage, loss, international cooperation, scientific discovery, and above all, humanity. As the months after the discovery went by, the Wahoo stopped being only a subject of historical analysis and became a constant presence in academic debates, international roundtables, and reflections on war memory. Every detail of the wreck, every centimeter of its corroded hull, every shadow captured by the ROV became another piece in a human and technological puzzle that continued to reveal new facets. What began as an investigation to find a lost submarine evolved into a deep exploration of how the meaning of remembering is built, lost, and recovered. One of the most recurring discussions revolved around the crew itself. Experts asked who the young men who had served under Morton really were. Military history usually refers to the 60 men of the Wahoo, but each of them had a name, a family, dreams, fears, a life before and during the conflict. With the discovery of the wreck, genealogists began tracing descendants, photographs, and family documents. It was thus that individual stories emerged, which, taken together, gave emotional depth to the submarine's tale. It was discovered, for example, that one crew member had left his pregnant wife without knowing his daughter would never get to meet him. Another young man, barely 19, had falsified his age so he could enlist and prove his bravery. Another, passionate about music, always carried a harmonica that he played during moments of rest, trying to relieve the collective stress inside the submarine's claustrophobic hull. A photograph revealed the crew posing on deck during one of the first patrols, some with shy smiles, others with serious looks, all unaware that their story would end abruptly and remain unknown for more than 6 decades. With these discoveries, historians began to emphasize that the true dimension of the Wahoo could not be measured only by the ships it sank or its military audacity, but by the lives that inhabited it. The value of a submarine does not lie in its steel, but in the people who breathe inside it. That perspective led to a series of specialized talks on how to approach military history from a more human angle, one that recognizes that each sunken vessel holds complete, deep, and often forgotten stories. Images of the wreck also awakened new sensitivities in the world of underwater archaeology. For years, many believed such remains should be treated as simple historical artifacts or technical pieces. But the Wahoo case showed that, more than remains, They are memorials. Memorials invisible to most of the world, hidden hundreds or even thousands of meters below the surface, but still demanding respect. That lesson led to the creation of stricter ethical codes for researchers and explorers, establishing that any war wreck must be treated with the same reverence as a cemetery. Objects must not be removed unless there is a legitimate and respectful scientific interest. Human remains must never be disturbed, and the images captured must be used responsibly, always remembering that behind every rusted rivet and every twisted plate lie irreplaceable stories. Over time, some artists began using the Wahoo story as inspiration for visual, literary, and cinematic works. Underwater painters created canvases depicting the hull lit by the ROV's spotlights, surrounded by silvery fish, as if the ocean itself were paying tribute to the submarine. Writers published historical novels intertwining fictional and real lives of American submariners, and screenwriters strove to build visual tales that captured both the emotion of war and the melancholy beauty of the deep sea. The Wahoo's story also found a prominent place in educational programs. In some American high schools, its history began to be taught as an example of the human cost of war and the power of international cooperation. Students looked at images of the wreck and debated military ethics, historical memory, and the importance of reconciling with the past to understand the present. In many classrooms, young people not only learned about a sunken submarine, but about the capacity of human beings to persevere in the search for answers, even decades after events have occurred. One of the most moving moments occurred during a commemorative event where descendants of the crew gathered with historians and Navy members. There, an elderly man who had served as a submariner on another boat during the war said in a trembling voice that the Wahoo represented the purest courage, not because it caused destruction, but because it faced an almost inevitable fate with stoic determination. His speech ended with words that deeply touched everyone present. Submariners do not fear the sea. We respect it. We know that if it claims us, it will protect us in its silence. The Wahoo rested in that silence for a long time, but today its story has breathed again. The metaphor of the sea as guardian resonated around the world, and it was not just a romantic vision, it had a physical basis. At that depth, light does not exist, sound travels differently, and life moves with an almost ritual slowness. The submarines sunk, they are not alone. They are surrounded by bioluminescent creatures, by gentle currents that caress the hull, by an ecosystem that adapts to their presence in an almost poetic act. The Wahoo ceased to be just a wreck and became an integral part of the underwater landscape, as if nature itself had decided to preserve it as a reminder of what once was. As global fascination with its story grew, philosophical debates also arose about the meaning of sacrifice. What drives 20-year-olds to risk their lives in almost suicidal missions? Is it duty, patriotism, camaraderie? Some scholars suggested that, in the case of submariners, there was a special bond. Living in such a confined space under such extreme conditions creates unbreakable ties. And those bonds, more than any military strategy, were what sustained crew morale during the most critical moments. Another aspect explored was Morton's mentality. Although his aggressive tactics had been criticized by some contemporaries, time proved his approach was key to redefining how American submarines operated in the war. Morton did not only sink ships, he changed paradigms. And although his story ended tragically, his influence endured, shaping later generations of submarine commanders. In naval ceremonies, his name is mentioned with respect, not as a reckless figure, but as a decisive leader. Because history, seen from the right distance, reveals nuances that could not be appreciated at the time. Courage is always easier to admire when it no longer threatens to destroy us. With the spread of studies and documentaries about the Wahoo, a digital archive was also created to preserve maps, analyses, photographs, testimonies, reconstructions, and all information related to the submarine. This archive became an invaluable tool for future generations, a treasure of memory accessible from anywhere in the world. There, anyone can see what the Wahoo looked like inside, read personal stories of the crew, and understand how war transforms not only territories, but entire lives. Ultimately, the Wahoo case opened an unexpected dialogue about the importance of closing historical wounds. Because finding a submarine does not only mean solving a military mystery, it means healing a wound that remained open for decades. For many families, the discovery did not dissolve the pain, but transformed it. It was no longer a directionless pain. It was a pain with a place. And that place, in the depths of the La Perouse Strait, became a symbol of memory, respect, and reconciliation. The Wahoo rests there, protected by perpetual darkness, but forever illuminated by human memory, which is more resilient than any steel hull. As long as its story continues to be told, in documentaries, classrooms, ceremonies, family conversations, its legacy will continue to sail through time, reminding us that even in the most tragic chapters, humanity finds a way to honor, understand, and heal.